This is Transcast from the MetTrans Transportation Center. I'm Matt Kaplan. Ours is a market-driven society, but are there sectors of society for which market forces are inappropriate? Or have they simply not been tried in these? Peter Gordon might say that our highways, and particularly the most congested of them, should be considered and even modeled. He and a number of colleagues have been doing just that, with results that may surprise you. Peter is a professor in the University of Southern California School of Policy, Planning, and Development. He is also part of USC's Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorist Events, or CREATE. He has written extensively about urban planning and transportation, along with the economic costs of terrorist attacks. He co-edited The Voluntary City, a collection of suggestions about how our city's vitality can be restored. Most important for today's discussion, he is a co-author of a research paper titled Modeling the Effects of Peak Load Pricing on Metropolitan Networks and Activities. What that's all about became clear in a wide-ranging conversation I had with Peter not long ago at USC. Peter, thanks so much for joining us on Transcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
The more I read of your work, the more I looked forward to what I suspect will be a stimulating, fascinating conversation.
I hope so.
With someone who clearly believes that the market and how it has functioned, and how it maybe you would feel it should function, has a lot to say about the mess that I was just in out here on the freeway next to USC, where we are sitting right now.
Well, there's a famous Will Rogers quote that you may have heard about. He wanted to fix the mess you're talking about, and he said, "My God, if only the cars were private and the highways were..." I think I said that backward. If only the cars were public and the highways were private.
Uh-huh.
You've heard that before?
I have not, no, but I knew where you were going with it.
Exactly. It's an oldie.
You have, I called it a catchphrase before we began. If price does not ration, something else will.
Certainly. Well, if things are scarce, there will be rationing. It isn't rationing yes or no or for it or against it. There will be rationing, and the question is, how do we ration? We can ration by people standing in line and waiting. First come, first served. Crowding is a rationing device. If we don't price, there'll be typically some first come, first served default mechanism. And first come, first served often leads to crowding. It often causes all kinds of other problems. So we might as well think seriously about pricing as the alternative. Pricing serves us well in most of the rest of our lives. And it's a little bit odd that we think of it as exotic when we talk about public facilities or public services.
Is it just a cultural or historical rut that we're in? Because we, in this country at least, think of the roads as largely being public resources open to all equally?
Well, I'm not sure, but I could argue that we've come full circle. In other words, all these things were private once upon a time. There were objections to having them private. There are reasons to make them non-private or unprivate. Now we have some objections to how that's working out. And now privatization is catching on more and more, not just in America, in the rest of the world too. Perhaps slowly, but I think it's coming back. So I think you could argue that there's a pendulum or a having come full circle situation that we're in. I think there is some dissatisfaction, not just by you, but many others, about the performance we get when we have it in public hands. So privatization is often thought about. Now, the cliche is, and I think it's correct, is that anything that can be metered can be privatized. Anything that can be metered can be sold, run privately. Revenues can be collected. And as you know, metering is becoming ever cheaper, because we can now have electronic toll taking, so it's perhaps less crazy than it would have been a few years ago.
And I have one of those little white boxes stuck on the top of my windshield here in Southern California. And all I hear are a couple of little beeps, and I just keep going on at whatever speed I'm going. I won't say precisely.
Exactly. They've been tested, I think, for 120 miles an hour. So as long as you stay below 120, you will get tolled.
Okay. We've talked about privatization, but one of the points you make in one of the pieces that I've read is that this can also be accomplished by public agencies,
Exactly.
and perhaps they have other reasons for considering this.
Right. In fact, California, oddly enough, has been a pioneer because I think the I-15 in San Diego is run by Caltrans. It does have some most modern pricing technology at work, time of day pricing, where the price adjusts to the amount of demand, which is exactly the way the real world works. And it's very interesting you bring that up because it is public transportation planners and others mimicking private market activity. So you're right, it doesn't have to be in private hands. If planners are in the mood to mimic what they would do as private owners, then they could do exactly like Caltrans is now doing on the I-15. I guess the only concern would be that, and I guess be a concern with private also, is that if it's public, then the mimicking private behavior becomes subject to political criticism. And the political criticism is always easy. Well, on the SR 91 segment in Orange County, which used to be private, the first criticisms when it came on some years ago, the toll lanes were referred to as Lexus lanes. And that was the put down. That was the put down. And the put down was, well, you're just pandering or catering to the rich. Now, it's interesting that when there's privatization talk, when there's tolling talk, I shouldn't say privatization, because there's this idea called hot lanes that you may have heard of.
Yeah.
And hot lanes
as opposed to HOV.
Exactly.
lanes.
Make the HOV lanes a toll lane and it becomes HOV/T or whatever, whole hot lanes. And yes, there were local politicians that wheeled out the old criticism, well, ain't these going to be Lexus lanes all over again? The reason that is not a very good criticism these days, it was a plausible criticism before we had the SR 91 and the I-15 experience when we didn't know what was going to happen. But of course, there's been a lot of research on who the SR 91 serves, for example, perhaps the I-15 also. And it's not just rich people. It's anybody that's willing to pay to get home, let's say, an hour early, to spend more time with their kid, all kinds of project vendor kind of people, in the days when we had a vibrant construction industry locally. If I can spend less time on the freeway, I can do one more job.
Yeah.
And if I can do one more job, I'm willing to do it. So it's very interesting that with the pricing option, you want everybody out there to evaluate what's best for me. Do I wait? Do I take a conventional lane? Do I rejigger or reroute myself? Or do I pay? You have choices. If you look at surveys of who travels when and what kind of traffic is out there, what times a day, it's very revealing. Most traffic during the peak hours are not work trips.
I was so surprised to read that in
I'm
your
happy
writing.
you're surprised.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I suspect a lot of politicians and policymakers would be surprised.
Perhaps. We've been talking about it for some years.
So they shouldn't be surprised.
We haven't been the only ones. But I think what's interesting is, first of all, whether it's the AM peak or the PM peak, most trips are not work trips. Now, you could jump to the conclusion that means they're less essential. Perhaps some are. And I will never know, nobody will ever know, and the only way we'll ever know what is the most essential, quote unquote, is to have people pay and queue up accordingly. Not queue up, but choose accordingly. Mm-hmm. And there are all kinds of things that you and I say no to in our daily lives because it ain't worth it. And we want people to say that when it comes to traveling on the crowded freeway during the peak hours. So sometimes I'll go to the matinee movie theater because I want to save a couple of bucks. Mm-hmm. And the reason there's a price differential is exactly the same thing. The owner has a fixed facility, and he knows that demand varies, and therefore price is going to vary. So it happens 1,000 times in our regular lives, and it shouldn't be a great leap to say that it should also happen when it comes to the road and highways.
You have actually studied, you and colleagues, the sort of price point at which this decision is made and which way people will go. That's something you'll love this, of course, because on that stretch, the SR-91, which I frequently use to get out to my parents in the desert,
Right.
and you have about, a mile and a half to make the decision, is it going to be worth it to me
Right.
to get into those lovely couple of lanes
Right.
that I don't have to share with very many other people? Or do I save the X number of dollars? And I do this little calculation in my head as to, okay, what's the pricing right now, and so on. I mean, I'm making a market decision.
Of course, and we make choices like that 1,000 times a day if you think about it. When to do what, how much of what to do. Do I recycle my shirt, meaning wash it, or do I throw it away, right? We make those decisions all the time. These are trade-offs that we each understand pretty well how to make for ourselves, but the idea that we can make them for all others by saying it's going to be first come, first served is really silly if you think about it. But that's the way policy is these days.
What did your research tell you about the price points that people will accept or not accept?
Right. Well, what we did is, in fact, on behalf of MeTrans, this is our most recent project, we modeled the LA area. By LA area, we mean the 5-county area transportation system. A lot of people do that kind of modeling. Our contribution was to have a highway network model that has the peak and off-peak periods where you can observe, you're not observing, you're simulating what it is that people will do in various pricing situations or pricing conditions. And we picked 2 prices. In fact, we picked just 2 scenarios because we spent 90% of our time building and testing the model, and then we had 10% left over for the 2 scenarios. And there are many more scenarios that can be tested, which we will test eventually. But all we did is we tested 10 cents a mile versus 30 cents a mile for all of the freeways in the region for all of the peak periods. Now, the real world would never behave that way, or the real world would never be run that way, because there are differences place to place, route to route, county to county, time of day, and so on and so forth. But let me just segue for a second. Every price in the world that you know of, whether it's tuition at USC or you name it, is subject to a lot of adjustment. In other words, the sellers never know what the right price is, and the seller wants to charge what he or she can get, but they never know that.
Just as true for Target and Sears.
Exactly. So it's always successive approximation, learning by doing, and all that. So in a real-world pricing situation, whether the facilities are privately owned or publicly owned, we imagine, it's easy to imagine, that whoever runs the thing is going to do some playing around and adjusting. Maybe they'll be adjusting forever because conditions change and prices change. But let me back up. Okay, not having that luxury, we just point blank said 10 cents a mile or 30 cents a mile. Those are the 2 scenarios. All freeway routes in the region, all of the peak hours, 6 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 7 p.m. So that's a very sledgehammer kind of test. However, even that was interesting, because even that showed that when you go to the 10 cents a mile scenario, then things do adjust in a nice kind of way. When you go as high as 30 cents, then a lot of people, at least in the model, say, no, thank you, I'll take the surface streets instead, and the surface streets crowd up horribly. So but this is something we learn. And if we test more sophisticated and plausible scenarios, we hope to learn a lot more.
And I should say that the graphs that demonstrate these 2 different models of the results of these 2 different suppositions are pretty dramatic just in the collection of data points.
Good.
I just learned in recent weeks about something that is being done on this freeway just off to our east here, the 110.
Right.
Can you talk about that model and what you think of it?
Well, I think many of us had been advocating the hot lane idea for some time, where the HOV lanes, some of them or all of them, are lanes that you can buy yourself onto, where there's a toll during the peak hours. Again, it's high time to take that seriously. So I'm happy we being whoever runs the 110 or whatever, because we built all these HOV lanes over the years. But there's very little evidence that those have altered behavior. The HOV lane idea originally was to encourage carpooling. And we were going to solve the traffic mess by encouraging carpooling. But of course, it hasn't happened. In other words, if you look at vehicle occupancy over the years that we have data for, vehicle occupancy for the work trip has not changed at all. In fact, I think it still trends downward. And if you look at the HOV lanes right now, just sort of peek over, I think what we have is what we call fam pools. In other words, the ride sharing is among families. It's where you're taking your kids or you're taking another family member somewhere, and you're qualified to get on the thing. But you haven't formed a carpool to get to work because there's an HOV lane available. So that experiment in social engineering, if I might use the phrase, has been a flop. Been a flop in terms of what we spent, because these things ain't cheap, and what we've gotten. So the idea that we can gain back some of the cost, we can justify some of the cost by putting the HOV lanes to a better use. That's the HOT lanes, the hot lanes, the toll lanes, is I think a fine idea.
What does all of this say for the commercial traffic on our Southern California freeways, if not elsewhere? The movement of goods, which of course is a primary concern of the organizations that we work for.
Well, that's a great question, and that's our next task, because the model's running, and we want to test now. We did not track in the test that you talk about the impact on freight movement, but we want to test the impact on freight movement. We want to test the impact on low-income people. There are all kinds of testing can be done. And again, the tests or the simulations are only indicative. Models are just models, and the real testing would come when there's a real facility where people can adjust, where the managers can adjust the prices. But I think that the modeling or the simulation is useful because it gets us off the dime. Because we're typically just making assertions. Lexus lanes, that's an assertion. So there has to be a better way to make policy. Modeling and simulation is the next logical step.
Let's assume for our purposes that the facts are clearly on your side, but you're still going to see, I think I can safely assume, a lot of resistance on the part of many community leaders, many grassroots members of the community who are still going to say, you can't do this, this is regressive, they're Lexus lanes.
Well, like I said, the best we can do, and we meaning the colleagues I work with, USC and Metrans, the best we can do is lay out the case. Our hope and our value added is that once you lay out the case, that there will be some people who begin to pay attention. Now, that's the hope, that's the idea. That may be extremely slow, but that is where we are. Now, there are many other people, everybody's specialized in something else. There are many other people who take information that is developed in the way of university research and bring it to the attention of people, whether it's the general public or political decision makers. People write op-eds. Now, that is a separate and interesting process, which is possibly hard to understand. In other words, it's hard to get a handle on how public opinion and political opinion evolves.
Probably harder to model even than the Southern California freeways.
Exactly.
I'm going to switch gears. Since we're talking about transportation. I usually would resist using that metaphor. But you also wrote, not too long ago, about infrastructure and how we improve it, how we do the things that need to be done to handle the kinds of loads that we're going to face, whether there are hot lanes or not. And looking at this not just locally within Southern California, but about how, in particular, something truly disastrous would affect not just Southern California, but perhaps the entire nation. And there were some conclusions that came out of this, which ought to be getting the attention of a lot of policymakers as well.
Sure. Again, we're testing, and this is with a national network instead of just the local LA network. We're testing what if, there are always bottlenecks. So what if there are new bottlenecks because some bridge is lost or some tunnel is lost? And of course, with all the terrorism talk, there's a lot of attention or there's a lot of focus on that. So if the bad guys close the Eisenhower Tunnel, manage to close the Eisenhower Tunnel, or if they manage to blow up some key bridges, and this is very much a freight question. Mm-hmm. What happens to the deliveries, and where do you get new shortages, and how do things realign? Now, the good news is that there's so much redundancy in our highway system. We're a fairly rich country, and there's so much redundancy that the truckers find ways around. Now, at a cost. They find ways around at a cost. And if you're the person that's hired the trucker, and he or she has to take an extra day to get there, it's going to cost you because these guys earn good money in overtime, and the cost structure in the economy will be affected. So again, we thought that was worth testing, worth examining. And again, our contribution in that research was mainly to show how to do it. In other words, people have been building highway network models for a long time, but to assemble the data, as we did, first of all, to have a model of the national highway network. Sounds simple, but you have to get data from many sources. To link that up with the national inventory of bridges and tunnels is not trivial.
This was a big part of the challenge, right?
Oh,
Getting
yes.
all these databases.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then linking that up with an economic model which simulates the trade between the states by commodity. So essentially the work was to put data together, to put models together that hadn't been assembled in quite that way before. And so now the model you're referring to is available to test any and all scenarios about what we might lose. Now, it isn't just terrorists. There are earthquakes, there are national calamities and disasters and things like that. So again, once you think about this stuff, you wonder why hasn't it been done before. But of course, always there's somebody comes along and does it first, and that's the idea.
And one of the conclusions that you were able to reach is that a bridge taken out or that falls down in an 8.5 here in Southern California, that the negative effect of that ripples out far beyond Southern California.
Sure, exactly, because as you know, we have one of the biggest ports in the region. A lot of the things that go in and out of the LA Long Beach ports serve the country. These are far-reaching effects. Again, because the ports are so important, being on the Pacific and being what they are.
So a representative from Southern California, or perhaps a senator from almost anywhere, might want to consider infrastructure improvements, even though they're not only not in his or her district. I guess I really should be talking about somebody out of state.
Exactly.
A senator from Minnesota or from Arizona should perhaps have real concerns about this kind of thing taking place in San Pedro or Long Beach.
Exactly. That was our idea when we started. In other words, yes, the national network is subject to Senate approval or Senate funding or congressional funding, and the natural impulse is for representatives to want to fund things in their own backyard. That's what they get elected for. But of course, you can use our research to show the local people that if there's something that happens that's not local, it could hit them. And so that's, again, the utility of what this was about.
So this model is now out there, and it's available, being used by other researchers?
We don't know who uses it, but it's available. And anything we do for METRANS is public record. So
we had an interesting sort of real-world, I won't call it an experiment because I don't think it was controlled, a real-world occurrence here in Southern California not long ago. And you wrote about it a little bit anyway in your blog, which, by the way, I highly recommend. Just Google Peter Gordon's blog, and by the way, I like your list of recommended films very much.
Wonderful.
But you addressed what came to be called all across this country, Carmageddon. And so here was, I don't know, were you able to look at this as sort of a real-world laboratory experience?
Well, we didn't do any scientific research on it. You know, we looked around and we saw what everybody saw. I think there's a wise man that once said all the doomsday forecasts that ever were wrong. And
because we're still here.
Well, yeah, you have. I mean, at one time there are asteroids that hit the world and wipe out the dinosaurs and things like that. Whenever there's a doomsday forecast, which there was, this is a big one. You want to check your pulse and check the time and check everything else, because these things are often hyped, and the hype takes on a life of its own. Because as we learned in Los Angeles during the '84 Olympics, that when people are freaked out, they're not sitting ducks. They're people. And they don't sit around and say, I'm stuck. I'm not going to sit around and wait for events to really hurt me. Mm-hmm. They adjust. They make choices. They make decisions. They make plans. They revise plans. I think that's the most interesting thing. People revise plans all the time. And people saw this is going to happen, a 2-day closure or something like that. And how can I adjust my life accordingly? So people will and can adjust all the time. That's a big reason the doomsday stuff is crazy, because the doomsday stuff overlooks such an essential part of human nature. Like I said, we're not lemmings that march over the cliff. You know, anytime there's a doomsday forecast, you want to back off and scratch your head and say, what's going on here? Now, the problem is that, it's the old, you cry wolf once too often, because there's going to be a closure in less than a year again, and local officials are going to do their rain dance all over again, and now people are going to say, well, these guys were wrong the last time, right?
Yeah.
So, credibility is an easy thing to lose and a hard thing to gain back. And
they give hurricane warnings as well.
Well, sure. And very often you hear people say that, if you say, hey, you really scared people and you were going way overboard in how you scared people, the answer is, wasn't good that we did, and that was our tactic all along. You see? That's not real good in terms of credibility, because, eventually you're found out, and when you have no credibility. So, but this is a game, not a game, but this is a dance, whatever you want to call it, that the policy people often get into, and the media people and all that. So I think we have to accept that for what it is. I'm a little bit concerned, to be honest with you, that having overblown it so badly this time, I don't know what they're going to do next time. Maybe next time, all the doomsday forecasts are wrong, right? And a subset of that is all the forecasts are wrong. So,
Well, some of your social scientist colleagues ought to be looking at this with as much interest as I think you must be.
Well, sure, but my training is in economics, and as you know, the economists haven't looked so good in recent years. I guess that's another topic for other people, not myself, to worry about, and that is that the experts, always with quotation marks around, have been so wrong so often, but that never stops them. So maybe humility is hard to come by. I don't know how that works.
It has been clear throughout this discussion that you have much, much more ahead of you in terms of refining the models that you've done, uncovering truths, hopefully, that may help us to deal with some of the biggest challenges we face in America, particularly the urban parts of America. What is ahead, if you don't mind restating that a little bit?
Well, as I mentioned to you before, we have created both a national network and an LA network where we can do lots of modeling and testing of various policies. And to go back to the LA story, and there's a question you asked, well, two questions you asked, which are high on our agenda. One is, what is the impact of peak load pricing on freight? And nobody knows. And we want to do that. And number two, what is the impact on various income groups and income categories? And that's what we're looking at too. But there are permutations and combinations of those scenarios that we can go on and on and on with. Now, we're also interested, beyond that, is what's the impact on land use and location? And we took a little bit of a stab at that in this research, and that is that the unexamined cliche is that if we had peak load pricing, rational pricing, there would be less what people call urban sprawl or suburban sprawl.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, again, those are assertions or those are conclusions that typically come out of very, very general, very highly aggregated models. And we want to go in the direction where we can say something about how development pressures would be affected if people make the kinds of substitutions that we talked about, when to go, where to go, and all that. Now, we have a very preliminary finding in the research that we've done, and the very preliminary finding is that if we do the pricing, at least the two scenarios that we tested, it has no effect on so-called sprawl and so-called
or
location.
like the density that people will put up with residentially.
Well, what we did is we tested the effect, the differential effect on various density zones and areas in the region. And we found out there is no pattern to how people living in various densities respond to the introduction of the pricing option. But that's a very preliminary finding. It's kind of a teaser, and it kind of raises more questions than it answers. So, yeah, that's interesting stuff, and
I'll say
we're happy to be involved in it.
It's a lot to look forward to. I just want to mention one other thing, and that is your recent book, published just a couple of years ago, The Voluntary City, that you co-edited with some colleagues, which apparently also touches on some of the subjects that we've been talking about.
Right. Well, one of the ideas when we put the book together, and the book has many chapters by many authors who talk about these options, and that is that it's still a cliche that markets work in some areas, but then markets fail or could fail, and then when markets fail, then public policy comes in. So kind of either or, black, white, either or kind of thing. And all the textbooks are full of that. And that's taught in all the classes, or many of the classes, and so on and so on. And what we look at is what we call market challenging situations. Not market failures, but market challenging situations. And that is that when existing arrangements fall short, what else can we do? Now, one of our discussions this afternoon has been along those lines. In other words, we talked about market-based or market-compatible policies. And so it's not just, if we look at the freeways again, we say, well, they're either public or they're private. Well, we've already gone over the fact that it need not be that simple. Public owners or public authorities can mimic private behavior, as they're now doing on the I-15, as we sit here. Okay, so the cliches, again, textbook cliches, ought to be challenged. And again, I'm quoting other people, but the thinking in American universities or American public policy circles, you can say there are two faiths. Some people say, well, markets fail, use government. And other people have been known to say, well, governments fail, use markets.
That's one we've heard a lot lately.
And we're saying markets fail, use markets. In other words, where markets fall down, as they must in some cases, are there market-based mechanisms that we can look at which would make the portfolio of public policies a little bit richer, a little bit more appropriate?
It's a wonderful title, The Voluntary City.
Thank you.
Very intriguing. And by the way, it is available from Amazon and I'm sure many other sources. And the publisher is the Independent Institute. And one of the co-editors has been our guest over quite a long time, the last well over a half hour now, Peter Gordon. Peter, thank you so much. This really has been fascinating, and I would welcome the opportunity to do it again someday.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And may those models continue to become more sophisticated and more reflective of the reality that I'm going to be facing out there when I get back on the freeway to go back to Long Beach.
I certainly hope so.
Peter Gordon is a professor in the University of Southern California School of Policy, Planning, and Development, and he's also attached to USC's Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorist Events, which has one of the great acronyms of all time, CREATE. And also, as you heard, has conducted research on behalf of METRANS, the METRANS Transportation Center. We hope you'll join us for the next edition of Transcast. You can also check out our library of past programs at metrans.org. That's metrans.org. Transcast is a production of the METRANS Transportation Center, which is funded by the United States Department of Transportation and the California Department of Transportation, Caltrans. Thanks for listening.